6 years I'd spent bringing Gaul to heel, tribe by tribe, river by river, and I had let myself believe the hardest part was behind me. Then, in a single winter, nearly all of it rose at once. Not one chieftain leading one revolt. Dozens of tribes under one man, for the first time since I'd crossed into this country. His name is Vercingetorix, young and better at this than I expected any of them to be. I was in Italy when word reached me, too far from my legions, too far from the war I was supposed to be fighting. I crossed the mountains in winter, through snow no army marches in, with a small escort and no legions at my back yet, because waiting for spring meant waiting for my own province to burn. The passes were closed by every reasonable measure. I went through them anyway, because the alternative was arriving to a war already lost, while I sat comfortably on the far side of a mountain range waiting for better weather. By the time I reached my men, the revolt had already cost me towns I thought were settled for good. I don't write this down to flatter myself later. I write it because it's true, and because what came after only makes sense if you understand how close the whole campaign came to unraveling before it properly began. Vercingetorix did something I hadn't seen from any Gallic leader before him. He told his own people to burn their own grain, their own towns, anything that might feed a Roman column passing through. 20 towns of the Bituriges alone put to the torch in a single day, on his own order, so that I would have nothing to forage and no reason to stay. It worked better than he had any right to expect. My legions live on what the land gives us as much as on what we carry, and a scorched country starves an army just as surely as a lost battle does. I won't pretend otherwise here. This was the most dangerous strategy any enemy had used against me in Gaul, and I respected it before I ever found a way to answer it. He spared one town from the burning, Avaricum, too valuable to lose, his own men argued, over his objection. I took it. It cost the defenders nearly everything, and it cost me time I badly needed elsewhere. Vercingetorix had been right to want it burned. I noted that too. After Avaricum, Vercingetorix pulled his army back to a hilltop stronghold called Alesia, in the country of the Mandubii. I still don't fully understand why he chose to sit still there after a strategy built entirely on movement and denial. Perhaps he believed the ground would hold where open battle would not. I can only report the decision, not the reasoning behind it. The hill itself is a strong position, steep on most sides, a plateau on top wide enough to hold his whole army, rivers running along 2 flanks. 60,000 of my men against, by the best count my officers could make, something near 80,000 inside those walls. A direct assault would have cost me an army I couldn't afford to lose this deep and hostile country. So I chose the slower method. Not a siege in the old sense, starve them out and wait. A wall. I would build a ring around the entire hill, seal every road, every path down to water, and let the mathematics of hunger do what my legions couldn't do safely by force. We began building immediately, and Vercingetorix's cavalry didn't let us build in peace. Sorties came almost daily, riders down from the hill trying to break the work before it closed, trying to catch my men digging with their tools in hand instead of their swords. We held the line and kept digging anyway, because a wall half finished is worse than no wall at all. The design wasn't simple earthwork. Ditches first, some filled with sharpened stakes driven into the ground and hidden under branches. My men called them lilies, for what little humor there was left in the work. Iron hooks set into buried logs, angled to catch a man's leg or a horse's before he ever reached the wall itself. Behind all of it, a rampart topped with towers, spaced close enough that no stretch of the line went unwatched. The ditches alone took most of the early weeks, some cut wide and deep enough to stop a horse outright, others narrower, closer to the rampart, filled with water diverted from the 2 rivers running along the hill's flanks. Between them, rows of sharpened branches driven into pits and hidden under loose brush, close enough together that a man couldn't step between them without finding one. Past those, iron hooks fixed into buried timber, angled up out of the ground where no eye would catch them until a boot or a hoof already had. 10 miles of it in the end, closing the hill completely. Ditch, stake, hook, rampart, tower, repeated around the entire circuit without a gap wide enough for a single rider to slip through unseen. I've built fortifications before. I had never built one meant to hold an entire enemy nation inside a single ring. And I didn't yet know that this ring would turn out to be only half of what the siege would eventually require of us. Before the ring closed fully, Vercingetorix made the one move I couldn't prevent. He sent his cavalry out through the gap that still remained, riders scattering across Gaul with a single message: return with every man who can carry a weapon, or watch your own people starve behind Roman walls. I understood immediately what this meant for me. It was no longer a siege of one hilltop. It was a wager that the whole of Gaul would answer that call faster than hunger could finish its work inside Alesia. If he was right, I would soon have two armies to face at once. One behind my wall, one coming up from every direction at my back. I had already begun planning for exactly that before his riders had cleared the first ridge. I gave the order for a second wall, not facing inward toward Alesia this time, but outward, facing every road a relief army might come down. Another line of ditches, stakes, towers, nearly 14 miles of it, built in the weeks it took word of the siege to spread across Gaul and an army to answer it. My own men were exhausted before the second ring was finished, and there's no point hiding that here. We were building fortifications against an enemy we hadn't yet seen, on top of fortifications already holding an enemy we could see every day from the towers. Some officers questioned whether we had the strength to hold both lines if both were tested at once. I gave the order anyway, because the alternative, one wall, and hope the numbers never came, wasn't a plan I was willing to trust my army to. We built it to the same standard as the first: ditches, stakes, hooks, towers spaced for signal fires as much as for archers, so that trouble anywhere along 14 miles could reach my camp before it reached a crisis. Where the ground allowed, I had my engineers dig a water-filled channel 20 feet wide in front of the rampart itself, the widest single obstacle on either ring, because whatever came at that outer wall would be coming at speed, and speed is the one thing a wide ditch takes away from a charge no matter how many riders are behind it. By the time it was finished, my own legions sat in a strip of ground between two rings of our own making, an army besieging a hill while bracing to be besieged ourselves. Camped on a strip of land I could walk across in less than an hour, with an enemy on one side who wanted us starved out and, soon enough, an enemy on the other who wanted us crushed before we could finish the job. What happened next inside Alesia, I learned only from what crossed the wall afterward, and I record it here because it happened, not because it reflects well on anyone involved. The grain inside the town was running out faster than Vercingetorix's people had planned for, with so many soldiers added to a hilltop built to feed far fewer. His council made a decision. The women, the children, the old men of the Mandubi, the very people whose town this was, were put out through the gates, sent toward my lines, so that the soldiers still inside would have more grain to last until the relief army arrived. I did not let them through. I could not risk that many mouths inside my own ring, not with my own supplies already stretched thin holding two fronts. So they stayed there, between the walls, neither side willing to take them in. Some of my own men, standing watch along that stretch of the line, reported hearing them at night for days afterward. Not fighting, not pleading at the wall itself, just the ordinary sounds of people trying to survive somewhere they had no shelter and no food. I won't describe at length what became of the ones who couldn't survive that. I set it down here because a true account of this siege has to include it, and because I made that choice myself, with my own reasons, and I'll let the reasons stand on their own without dressing them up as anything other than what they were. Word reached us of the size of the relief army before we saw it with our own eyes, and I recorded the figures my officers brought me. Near 250,000 men, drawn from nearly every tribe in Gaul, the largest single host this country had ever raised in one place. I set the number down as it was reported to me. Whether it was accurate is a separate question, and I'll say plainly that historians studying this siege long after my time have doubted it, and I don't think they're wrong to. What mattered to me at the time wasn't the precision of the count. It was the shape of what was coming. An army large enough by any reasonable estimate to outnumber my own several times over. closing on a position where I was already holding a second enemy inside my own lines. I had built 2 walls for exactly this possibility. I was about to learn whether 2 walls were enough. When the relief army came into view, filling the plain beyond my outer ring as far as I could see, I understood the position for what it was, and I won't claim I felt nothing at the sight of it. 60,000 of my own men, holding a ring against 80,000 on the hill, and now facing something close to 250,000 more at our backs, with no ground behind us to fall back to that wasn't already committed to the siege. There was no retreat that didn't mean abandoning the wall, and abandoning the wall meant Vercingetorix's army walking free, with the very force that had come to save it. I had brought my legions into this position with my own decisions, 1 wall at a time, and there was no undoing any of it now. Every man in that strip of ground between the 2 rings understood the arithmetic as well as I did. We couldn't reinforce one wall without weakening the other, and we couldn't fall back from either without losing both. I split what I had as evenly as the ground allowed, kept the cavalry mobile enough to ride to whichever line broke first, and told my officers plainly what I expected of them. Hold, and if you cannot hold, hold anyway, because there is no ground behind you worth retreating to. The only way through was to hold both lines at once, for as long as it took, with whatever we had left to hold them with. I gave the orders I had to give and waited to see which wall would be tested first. The relief army moved first, sending its cavalry against my outer ring in the open ground before the infantry could follow. I answered with my own horse. German riders, allies I had brought into this campaign specifically because they fought in a style the Gauls hadn't prepared for, closer and harder than cavalry usually risks. The fighting ran the length of the day, back and forth across open ground with no clear advantage either way until late in the afternoon, when my German riders broke through in a single determined push and scattered the Gallic horse in front of them. It was the first clear success I'd had since the relief army arrived, and I noted it for what it was worth. Not a victory that decided anything by itself, but proof that the outer wall could be defended by men still standing on their feet after the day's fighting. 2 nights later, the relief army tried the wall itself, in darkness, hoping to close on our defenses before my men could see them coming clearly enough to answer in force. They came with grappling hooks, ladders, bundles of brush to fill the ditches, moving along the full length of the outer ring at once, so that no single point of my line could be reinforced without weakening another. My men held their positions in the dark by instinct as much as sight, throwing back what they could reach and holding what they couldn't see clearly at all. It was close fighting, blind fighting, along a wall built to be defended by daylight, and now tested in conditions it was never designed for. By the time the assault broke off before dawn, the line had held everywhere, but only just, and I knew the relief army would try again with everything they had left. They found what I hadn't wanted them to find, a stretch of my outer wall on the slope of a hill called Mount Rhea, where the ground itself made the fortifications weaker than anywhere else along the ring. They struck there with their main force. At the same hour, Vercingetorix launched his own men against my inner wall from the opposite direction, so that I was fighting in 2 directions at once at the single worst possible moment to be doing so. The position at Mount Rhea began to give. My officer there, Labienus, was holding 6 cohorts against a force pressing him from the outside, while Vercingetorix's men pressed the inner wall at the same point from within, the one stretch of ground on the entire circuit where both sieges met, and the one place a single collapse would have undone 10 miles of work in an afternoon. I committed my reserve cavalry there myself, riding out from the camp with every man I could pull from elsewhere along the lines, because if that stretch of wall fell, both rings would fail together within the hour. I won't claim I knew for certain, in that moment, which way it would break. The fighting there had gone on long enough that men on both sides were making decisions on exhaustion rather than orders. And a battle in that condition can turn on very little. One commander's nerve, one gap noticed a moment too late, one charge arriving from an angle nobody expected it from. I only knew that everything I had built over the preceding weeks
came down to whether that particular slope held for a few more hours of daylight. It held. My cavalry struck the relief force from behind, where they hadn't thought to watch, and the line that had been pressing Labienus for most of the day broke apart within minutes of that charge landing. The relief force broke first, all along that stretch of ground, and once one part of their line gave way, the collapse spread faster than any order of mine could have managed alone. Once the line at Mount Rhea broke, the retreat that followed wasn't an orderly one.
Men scattered from a host that had taken weeks to gather, and had held together only as long as it looked capable of winning. By the time the sun went down that day, the army that had come to save Alesia no longer existed as an army at all. Just scattered bands making their way back to whatever tribe had sent them, with nothing to show for the effort but the dead left behind on the field. Inside Alesia, word of the collapse would have reached them within hours. There was no relief coming a second time. Whatever hope had kept that hill fighting through weeks of hunger and 2 rings of siege works ended with that single afternoon on the slope of Mount Rhea. The next morning, Vercingetorix called his council together inside the town, and I learned afterward what was decided there. Surrender, offered as his own choice rather than one forced on him by others, though by then there was little choice left for anyone inside those walls to make. He came out to my camp and laid down his arms in front of me. I recorded it plainly, without ceremony, because that's how it happened from where I stood. Other accounts written after my time describe it differently. A dramatic gesture, weapons cast down at my feet in a single motion meant to be remembered. That version comes from Plutarch, writing more than a century later, and I'll say here that it reads more like the story a later age wanted to tell than the moment I actually witnessed. What I can confirm is simpler. The war that had cost both of us everything ended that morning, quietly, with one man's surrender to another. Vercingetorix lived 6 more years after that morning, held as a prisoner while I finished what remained of the Gallic campaign and the wars that followed it. In the end, he was brought to Rome, walked through the streets in my triumph as the war's defeated symbol, and executed by strangulation once the ceremony that required his presence was finished. I set it down plainly because that's what it was. The ordinary end Rome gave to enemies it had beaten badly enough to fear remembering them alive. Gaul did not rise again the way it had under him. Whatever else can be said about how this war ended, that much held for good. I've written most of what's known about this siege myself, in my own hand, for my own reasons, and history has largely taken my word for it in the centuries since. That's worth remembering, whoever reads this account next. That nearly everything known about the man who came closest to beating me survives only through the words of the man who beat him.